Every day when I wake up in the morning, I see the sky and I think about the things that you've made, all the beauty and your glory is showing, yeah. It never bores me to look at the ocean. The waves are crashing and the water spraying up in my face. I look above and all the seagulls are soaring, yeah. We've got to overcome the darkness so we don't get caught in the middle, between the hopeful and the heartless. So, hello, good day, good morning, I just can't stop smiling, because today is a brand new day, and all the darkness and the pain is just fading behind me. Oh Lord, what a beautiful day. All the planets surround me, the way they orbit just boggles my mind, the way the sun keeps on shining, yeah. We got to overcome the darkness so we don't get caught in the middle, between the hopeful and the heartless. So, hello, good day, good morning, I just can't stop smiling, because today is a brand new day, and all the darkness and the pain is just fading behind me. Oh Lord, what a beautiful day. There's nothing to fear, it'll be okay. It's the day that the Lord has made. It's the day that the Lord has made. There's nothing to fear, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. It's the day that the Lord has made. It's the day that the Lord has made. So, hello, good day, good morning, I just can't stop smiling, because today is a brand new day, and all the darkness and the pain is just fading behind me. Oh Lord, what a beautiful day.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Live with Doug. Glad to have you along. We are continuing our look at New Covenant theology. Great to see you. Hey, Andy. Hey, Dale. Rob, good afternoon. Ken, good morning. Looks like you changed your logo there. Hey, Mark. Welcome. Glad you could join us from Pennsylvania. Good to have you. So a couple programming notes. Number one, Wednesday, there will be no live stream. I think I have shared with you, was it Friday? Sometime recently, that my daughter and my son-in-law are... how can I say this discreetly? They're heading to places that Christians don't go to. A place sorry, I got distracted by Ken answering my question. They're going to a place that Christians do not go to vacation, if you know what I mean. And they are going to do the Lord's work there. It's going to be something for my wife and I. Anyway, so we will be spending Wednesday with them, our last time with them, take them to the airport, that kind of thing. So no live stream on Wednesday. Also on Saturday, my plan is to do our next Cross to Crown Partners Zoom meeting. That'll be at 10:30 Mountain Time. So for those of you who are partnering with us, we will be sending out a link here today or tomorrow so that you can join us on Saturday. And it's not too late. If you would like to sign up and be a partner, go to crosstocrown.org. Click on CTC Partners, sign up to support us monthly, and we will include you on that Zoom call. And we'll talk about New Covenant theology. We'll talk about anything you want to. I'm here to serve you for that hour and a half, something like that. So anyway, just want to let you know about that. All right, so let's go back and remember the framing of the question. What is the difference between covenant theology, dispensational theology, and New Covenant theology? And it really revolves around answering these questions. What is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament? These two major divisions in our Bibles. As you pick it up and you read it, imagine somebody reading it for the first time. And if they pick up a typical English Bible, they're going to have Old Testament, and then they're going to see a page that's white mostly and has big headings, New Testament. So obvious division. They look at their table of contents, an obvious division here. Well, what is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament? You've got all these key figures in the Old Testament, Adam and Abraham and Moses and David and so on. And then you get to the New Testament, and there's Jesus and the apostles and the church and all that. Well, what's the relationship? Is it primarily one of continuity? Is it primarily one of discontinuity? Like, are they mostly related halves or unrelated halves? How do we make sense of all this? Well, covenant theology and new covenant theology answer those questions differently. All three of the groups answer them differently. By the way, I apologize. I am tired. I hardly slept last night. My brain is foggy. So if I say something that seems obviously wrong, erroneous, that I misspeak, would you please call me out on it here in the chat? Because my mouth and my brain are not necessarily completely in sync. So anyway, so we've looked at covenant theology in a little more detail than we have dispensational theology, and I'll recap that here in a moment. Dispensationalism, remember, is kind of that the apples and oranges, the relationship between the old and the new. They would say it's strongly discontinuity oriented. It's almost completely separate. So here is a quote from the book Progressive Dispensationalism, and I would say this is the most common dispensational belief today, and it's summarized well in this book by Daryl Bach, and I forget who the other author is. Anyway, it's called Progressive Dispensationalism, and they say this: dispensationalism believes that God has planned a succession of different dispensations throughout history, both past, present, and future. Understanding these dispensations, these different relationships God has had and will have with humanity, is crucial for comprehending the teaching and message of the Bible. So let me pull a couple things out of that. According to dispensationalism, and that's why it's called dispensationalism, it's the view that God relates to humanity differently in the different dispensations. And as far as language goes, it's important to know something about this. You'll hear, like Calvin, for instance, who is not a dispensationalist. He predated the beginning of dispensationalism by quite a long time. The word dispensation simply means a period of time, an epoch, we might say, an era kind of thing. So you'll hear John Calvin use the word dispensation. An English translation of some of Calvin's works, he'll use the word dispensation. Sometimes, the old dispensation might be a way of referring to the Old Covenant or Old Testament era, and the new dispensation might be relating to Jesus in the New Testament. So terminology-wise, we need to realize that's just a word that means a period of time. Dispensationalism says these epochs or eras are not simply different ways of describing a period of time, but God is, by design, relating to humanity differently. So the original dispensationalists had, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the original dispensationalists had 7 dispensations. Right? There was a dispensation with Adam, and then was a pre-flood, and then post-flood, and then Abraham, something along those lines. Anyway, you can look up the Schofield notes and find those. But and again, I want to stress, and let me show you here again from the book. These different relationships God has had and will have with humanity. So, do you see the difference? They're not simply saying that it's like I could refer to the pre-flood dispensation as just a way of saying there was a period of time that was prior to the flood in Noah's day. And I might make a statement about what happened during that time. Men lived to be, 900 years frequently. We've got Adam living to be 930 and Methuselah 969, many centuries. So I could say something like during the pre-Noahic dispensation, men lived to be hundreds and hundreds of years old. That's simply using the word dispensation to refer to the time before Noah. And I'm making a comment about how long men lived. That's not what dispensationalism does. Dispensationalism says God's interaction with humanity. He had his plan for humanity was specific to this dispensation, and then when the next dispensation came in, he started interacting with man differently. And again, the old school guys, the original dispensationalists, even talked about different ways of salvation, that kind of thing. So I hope you're seeing the difference. Those of you who are very familiar with this and maybe grew up, theologically in dispensationalism, this all makes sense to you. For those of you who didn't, you've just got to get clear in mind that they put great stress on God's changing of his interaction with humanity in the different dispensations. Most today don't divide into the 7 dispensations. They basically kind of lump together the past as one dispensation, and then the present day, the current dispensation that we are in now, dispensation of grace. They might call the old one the dispensation of law and call the one we're in now the dispensation of grace. And then the next one, the one we're waiting for, is the millennial dispensation, and there may be a different name for that, but that's the basic idea. So do you see what I'm saying? Whereas before, in the old days, they would divide it up into several. Now it's usually just past, present, future, and that's kind of even summarized here in this quote I gave you. So let me just give you graphically here, for those of you via video, recap the 2 different views of covenant theology and new covenant theology. I'm sorry, dispensational theology. See, my brain in my mouth. So there's the basic picture, the acorn to oak tree, the one covenant of grace spanning the entire history of mankind, what they call redemptive history, and it's great continuity. Just everything is an unfolding of this one covenant of grace. Whereas dispensationalism says you've got all this pre-Christ dispensation, the old covenant era, Old Testament era, whatever you want to call it. You got Abraham, Moses, David, all of that is a dispensation. And then you see here I have the new covenant and the church in parentheses, and that's not my doing, that's theirs. This whole age of grace, this whole age of Gentiles, the age of the new covenant and the church, they would say this is all a parenthetical era or dispensation. And then eventually the church is going to be raptured so that we can get to the next dispensation, and that's the millennial kingdom, which is predominantly a Jewish kingdom. So do you see the difference between these two? They're almost, sort of mirror images of each other. Covenant theology sees great continuity and basically one storyline, the covenant of grace. Dispensationalism sees that the church age is an interruption, and the old guys would say an unplanned interruption in the story of Israel. John Riesinger helpfully summarizes this in his book, Abraham's Four Seeds. He says, dispensationalism cuts the Bible in half and never the twain shall meet. Covenant theology does the exact opposite and merges two distinctly different covenants, the old and the new, into one covenant with two administrations. Remember we talked about last week the one covenant of grace, two dispensations. Dispensationalism cannot get the Old Testament into the New Testament in any sense, and covenant theology does not even have a really new covenant. They have a newer and older version of the same covenant. Dispensationalism cannot get the two testaments together, and covenant theology cannot get them apart. It's a great summary of the differences here. So part of the challenge of describing what I believe, what we believe as New Covenant theologians, is, if you're talking to a covenant person, they're going to agree with you on some things, and they tend to put New Covenant theology in the camp of dispensationalism because we agree with dispensational theology on some things. And then you're talking to a dispensational theologian, and they tend to put us in the covenant theology camp because we agree with covenant theology on some things. But we disagree with both camps on the central theme of Scripture and the most important things. So anyway, it's just this whole thing can get confusing because those other two groups are kind of polar opposites of each other, and we are we're not really in between, but we see truth in both schools. Dale says, I believe some say that the new covenant of Jeremiah is only for ENT, Israel, and Judah. What's ENT? Yeah. Tell me what that is. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering that. Yeah, so the old school dispensationalists, when they come to Jeremiah and quoting Jeremiah, like the writer of Hebrews does, and God promised a new covenant, they are emphatic that is for Israel and Judah, because that's what it says, right? I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. The problem is they don't read the New Testament, which tells us that all of those promises were a mystery, and what has now been revealed about the mystery is the Gentiles were included in all those promises. But we'll come back to that a little bit further down the road. All right, so let's get to New Covenant theology. And got my silly little butterfly picture there. But remember, if covenant theology is acorn to oak tree, and dispensational theology is apples and oranges, I like to think of New Covenant theology as caterpillar to butterfly. The relationship between the old and the new is this entity, the caterpillar, the old covenant, and all the promises and everything God did in the Old Testament. It's all real and true and good and has its place, but then we find out it was always intended to metamorph into the new covenant. So we look at things like this, that the Old Testament is promise and the New Testament is fulfillment, and in particular, fulfillment in Jesus. As Paul says to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 1:20, all the promises of God are yes in him, speaking of Christ. So you read through the Old Testament and you see Adam and Abraham and Moses and David and all these promises, and you think, oh, it sounds like God's making great promises to Abraham. He's making great promises to Israel, great promises to David, and he is. But then you come to the New Testament and Jesus shows up and says, yeah, that's all about me. I am David. I am Abraham's seed. I am the firstborn, the fulfillment of God's promise to his Old Testament firstborn, Israel. Jesus said this, it's all about me. And that's what we see. as New Covenant theology. We see the Old Testament as shadow and the New Testament as substance. Again, Jesus being the substance. This is language from Colossians, for instance, describing the Sabbath. And think about that imagery, shadow and substance. If we're out on a sunny day and we see the shadow of a building, we can learn something about that building, right? Let's say we can't see the building yet. We just see the shadow. We begin to see some shapes and form an opinion about what this thing is. And it looks like a square. It looks tall. It looks maybe you can see a porch or windows or something that's kind of, you can sort of make out sort of what's there. But then you turn and see the actual substance itself, and it's far more glorious. And you realize, oh, I got a vague outline in the shadow, but now looking at the substance. Or maybe a better analogy would be you see the shadow of a person, and you begin to form some opinions on how tall this person is, or how fat, or how big their muscles are, or whatever, how long their hair is. And then you turn and see the person, and you realize, oh, I got a picture. I got an image in my mind, but now I turn to look at the substance, and it is in 3D and it's in color, and I now see what it really looks like. Well, that's how the scripture is presented to us. In the Old Testament, we see shadows, and then in the New Testament, we turn and see, oh, it's Jesus. He's the fulfillment of everything promised in the Old Testament. Another way to say it is picture and reality. Picture and reality. I like to describe this as when I travel, I have a picture of my wife as the screensaver on my iPad, the lock screen. So that whenever I open up my iPad, boom, there she is. And she's beautiful. And I like to rotate around the pictures and have a little variety, right? I don't kiss my iPad. I look at the picture and think, wow, she's pretty. When I come home, I see my wife as she really is. And I do kiss her. And imagine if I walked in the door and there's my wife, and I grab my iPad and say, hey, look, I'm going to stare at my iPad and talk to my iPad when the reality is right there. If I kiss my iPad instead of kissing my wife, that would not go over very well. The Old Testament is a picture, and it gave us a real description of what God was doing, but then Jesus shows up and he's the reality. Finally, the antitype type. Again, this is language borrowed from Hebrews, for instance. The Old Testament is the type, and I actually probably should have reversed those, because the type is the outline looking forward, and the antitype is the actual thing itself, again, that we see in Christ fulfilled. All right, let me summarize it this way. God's plan for the universe is Jesus. You want to know what New Covenant theology is? In my opinion, it is this. God's plan for the universe is Jesus. And if I can just make another shameless plug here, my little book called Exalted, that is the whole point of that little book, is to show you that according to the scripture, the plan for the universe, the purpose statement for the universe is Colossians 1:18, that he might come to have first place in everything. The purpose statement of the universe is not the glory of God. The Westminster Confession is wrong, or at least it's incomplete. When the Westminster Confession says the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, you can't take me to a single text of Scripture that says that. But I can take you to several texts of Scripture that say something like, everything was created for him, Jesus. Everything exists so that Jesus would come to have first place in everything. God's plan for the universe, God's plan for the USA, God's plan for you and your marriage or your singleness or your job, God's plan for Russia and Ukraine and every creature that exists. His plan, his purpose in creating it all was for Jesus. not because he's a covenant-keeping God and he wants to display his glory and has this covenant of grace, not because of Israel. It's about Jesus. The Bible is the story of Jesus. We are not supposed to read the Bible as a story of Abraham or Israel or David or the covenant of grace, which doesn't occur in the Bible anywhere. No, the Bible is a story of Jesus. Everything in the Old Testament prefigured, pointed to, or prepared for the coming of Jesus. Let me say that again for anyone who isn't watching video but listening. Everything in the Old Testament prefigured, pointed to, or prepared for the coming of Jesus. When we talk about finding Jesus on every page of the Old Testament, have you heard that phrase? I've used that phrase many, many times. We have to be careful. It's not, the Old Testament is not an allegory. Like the thread, the red scarlet scarf or other, that Rahab used to let down the spies. And, people say, oh, it's red. That's the blood of Jesus that saved the spies. And maybe, it's possible, but that's getting closer, in my opinion, to an allegorical reading, which I don't think we're supposed to read the Old Testament that way. So when we say find Jesus on every page, it doesn't mean that we're supposed to read it allegorically. So what does it mean? How do we find Jesus on every page? It's this event, this person I'm reading about, the situation. Is this prefiguring it? Is it actually giving us a picture like lambs that are sacrificed? They prefigure Jesus because he's the lamb who will take away the sins of the world, or who does. Does it point toward Jesus in some way? Does it prepare? Like the nation of Israel. Think about the story of Esther. You've probably heard that God, Yahweh, the Lord, is not even mentioned in the book of Esther. Why is the book of Esther in the Bible? I think to remind us that God was never going to allow the Jewish people to be decimated and completely destroyed, because if that happened, there would be no Jesus. Right? Same thing with all the predictions in Isaiah and Jeremiah when God says, I'm going to wipe out the city of Jerusalem. I'm going to destroy everybody. He always says there's going to be a remnant. Why? Because if he wiped out every Jew before Christ, there would be no Christ. So the whole history of Israel was preparing for the coming of Jesus. That's what I mean when we say that everything points to Jesus, prepares for, or prefigures. And finally, two more. Our laws are the commands given by Jesus. We don't look to Moses for our laws. Those were the laws given to Israel. We look to the command of Jesus, the Great Commission, disciple the nations, teaching them to obey all that I commanded you. And covenant theology comes along and says, sure, but Jesus told us to obey Moses. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. Your theology tells you that's what Jesus said, but that's not what Jesus said. Finally, our covenant is the one Jesus initiated. Our covenant is not the covenant with Adam, because there is no covenant with Adam specifically mentioned. Our covenant is the new one, and it is a new one. It's not a newer something. It is a new covenant that God initiated with us through Christ. So in a nutshell, those are the significant affirmations of New Covenant theology that are different from the other two schools of thought. Let me catch up on a few comments here, and then we will call it a day. Dale says, ENT, ethnic, national, and territorial Israel. Thank you. That's helpful. I guess I'm out of the loop. I'm not familiar with that. Lon says, don't you think most non-denominational churches teach more like NCT? Maybe. What in my experience, most non-denominational churches would sound like us until it comes to the end times, and then they would say they're waiting for the rapture and for the tribulation and the Antichrist and all that. So that seems to be, but maybe I'm wrong. But that's been my impression. Looks like Milligan's Island is agreeing with me there. Yeah. Back to the Bible. Jesus was very clear himself that there were mysteries of the kingdom only made known to the 12 and not the rest of the people. So when people say the Old Testament can be taken by itself, it blows my mind. Yeah, and we're told by Paul that the mystery is, one of the great mysteries is, those promises made to the 12 were always intended ultimately to be fulfilled in the new covenant people. Doug, have you heard of the Dakes Study Bible? Dakes? No, I have not. Is that a dispensational study Bible? Minimation says, I used that same picture staring at the iPad analogy yesterday when I taught from Colossians in church. Yeah, good. Rob says, Ephesians 3 is an interesting section that reveals the unity of God's work as well. Yep, that's exactly the passage that talks about the mystery that the Gentiles were always part of the promise, just not mentioned in the Old Testament so clearly. Nathan says, Jesus heals the man so they know that he can forgive sins. We are unable to see the spiritual, so I, just like miracles, think the Old Testament is a physical story to help us understand the reality of the spiritual. Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. There's the picture. The Old Testament gives us a picture of what God is doing in the New. Lon says, blessings to your daughter and husband in this great work God called, but you and Krista have prepared. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's we're proud of them. We're bittersweet, right? Got to send our son-in-law and daughter across the world into harm's way, trusting the Lord, and yeah, thank you. Back to the Bible. New creation, that's why through Jesus, God is reconciling the world to himself. And exactly. Dean Floyd, day 3 of creation speaks of trees bearing fruit after its kind with its seed in itself. Yep. I'm not sure what statement I said that's referring to. He follows up, Jesus is our kinsman, same type of fruit, and is the seed that dies planted. Is that, are you giving some analogies there of the promise fulfillment or picture reality kind of thing? Innovation. So does this mean God planned for Adam to fall in the garden so Christ could come and solve the sin darkness problem? Yeah, to put it shortly, yes. I believe so. Milligan, yes, the Dake Study Bible is dispensational, classical, not it's a classical dispensational study Bible. Is it? Interesting. All right. Well, there you go. There's a resource for you all. All right. We will call it a day there and come back tomorrow and continue on looking at these things. Have a great day. Grace and peace to you.